would soon discover and be overwhelmed by the proliferating nature all around him. Neruda remembers that his father would take him into remote and unsettled areas of the Cautín province. There he encountered a natural world densely populated with plants and insects. A falling tree trunk in the middle of the forest was a unique treasure, filled with countless species of spiders and beetles, bright and colorful as the rainbow itself. Through discoveries like these, a strong bond between nature and his poetic imagination began to forge, which would prove to be unbreakable and continuous all throughout his life. But despite the fact of having the care and affection of his stepmother, along with a company of siblings, cousins, and uncles, Neruda the child will always feel an acute sense of loneliness, of that of being apart from everybody else. That feeling was not at all eased by the fact that his father will be away from the home more and more. In the poetic imagination of the child, the figure of the father will identify itself with that of the train, all-powerful and unreachable, that takes him far away from the home only to return him back tired in the middle of the night. That father, transmuted into the image of the train, will come in and out of the poet's life, and at times will seem harsh and distant, both loved and feared. In the same manner that his mother had left him to go nourish the grapes of his native Parral, the image of the father will be closely tied to the symbol of the train, such as in this poem titled The Father.
The brusque father comes back from his trains. We could pick out his train whistle, cutting the rain, a locomotive's nocturnal lament, an implacable howl in the dark. Poor durable father, there on the axle of life, rugged in friendships, your cup overflowing. The whole of your life was a headlong militia, between daybreaks and roadbeds, comings and goings, you lived on the double. Then, on the rainiest day of them all, the conductor, José del Carmen Reyes, boarded his death train and has not come back to us since.
The child then will invent a world of his own, both his paradise and refuge. He will find it in the woods, but also in another kind of paradise, this one made up, however, out of processed wood, in the world of books. His first readings will be the stories of Buffalo Bill, the pirate voyages of Emilio Salgari, and the fantastic tales of Jules Verne. Neruda recalls that he began to write soon after he learned to read, and that he wrote his first poem when he was 7 years old. In his autobiography, he writes that he felt an intense emotion and a desperate need to write things down. Surprised and excited, he showed his first poem to his father, who looked at it, read it, and with great skepticism asked him where he had copied it from. Neruda recalls, with humor and irony, that was her first taste of literary criticism. This passage takes on a greater significance when you consider the bittersweet relationship Neruda will always have with future critics. In 1910, Neruda begins school at the Liceo de Temuco, and his world, especially his literary world, will grow and expand even more. One of his teachers will initiate him in the cult of the French poets, so in vogue at that time. Baudelaire, Rimbaud, and Verlaine, among others. Later, under the guidance of another great teacher, he will begin reading the great 19th century Russian novelists, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Chekhov. That teacher's name was Gabriela Mistral, who many years later, in 1945, would win the first Nobel Prize for Literature ever given to a Latin American, and the first woman to win such a distinguished honor. But at the time she arrives in Temuco to take on the position of director at the School for Girls, she was just starting to be recognized among literary circles in Chile. Neruda overcomes his shyness and timidly befriends her. He soon begins to visit her at the school, always leaving with a couple of books under his arm. It is quite a remarkable coincidence that these two future Nobel winners should meet in such a remote place as Temuco. During the 10 years that Neruda studies at the Liceo de Temuco, he grows tall and thin. He becomes a young man. He reads and writes voraciously. But even though the affinity for writing poetry was already present within the family, the father does not consider it an appropriate activity for his eldest son. Neruda's insistence in writing poetry will soon push the father to modify his passive resistance. As the boy grows, the indifference changes to threats, and the threats turn into real prohibitions. But Neruda had an iron will. He ultimately creates for himself a mask and takes on a pseudonym that will allow him to write without being bothered at home. This is how the name Pablo Neruda comes into being. Neruda was an homage to John Neruda, one of the most beloved short story writers of Czechoslovakia. The choice of his first name is uncertain, but it is likely that he chose it after the great French symbolist poet Paul Verlaine. But perhaps he was not aware that Pablo in Hebrew means he who says beautiful things. He would not know it, but he certainly was determined to fulfill that symbolic prophecy. So in 1920, from that moment on, Ricardo Neftali Reyes will take on the name Pablo Neruda, a name born out of the rebelliousness and his strong conviction of his chosen destiny. But Pablo Neruda, as we have come to know him, the persona and the poet, it's still a work in progress. He still suffers from an extreme case of shyness, which is even more acute in the presence of the opposite sex. But little by little, he overcomes his shyness and becomes one of the most active members of his high school.